Welcome to another episode of In the Name of Service, a podcast committed to sharing the untold stories of those who selflessly serve. Each episode features an interview with men and women who have been called to a variety of service-focused roles, such as the military, law enforcement, ministry, volunteering, and more. You aren't likely to know the names of the individuals you meet here, but our hope is by the end of our time together, you'll not only know their stories, but possibly be inspired to write your own in some way. Humble in nature, but strong in character, these everyday men and women showcase what it is to truly be a servant. We're glad you're here. Now here's your host, Dr. Barb Thompson.
Welcome to episode 3 of the In the Name of Service podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Barb Thompson. Here, we broadcast stories of men and women who've answered the call to serve in hopes of inspiring and catalyzing the rest of us to follow suit in our own way. Today's interview is with Josh Armstrong. He is a current seminary student, husband, and father of 3. Josh and I met during his service as a Special Tactics Officer, or STO, in the Air Force. He's one of the most thoughtful, selfless, and hardworking individuals I know, and I'm so excited for you to hear from him. A few things struck me about this conversation that I wanted to share up front so you can catch them during our conversation. The first is the detail in which Josh recalls his development during his formative and college years. If you are a young person currently searching for answers, you'll want to listen to this. And if you in any way are in a position to shape young people, pay attention. You may very well be one of the most influential and positive voices in that person's life, catapulting them into a life of purpose and impact. The second is the specificity of the resources Josh has utilized along the way. Check the show notes after you listen, because I've included a list of Josh's most influential books from earlier in life, as well as his current reading list, his favorite podcasts, and a few important links. The first is for more information on Air Force Special Tactics, and the second is the Working Genius Assessment, where you can learn more about which tasks at work give you joy and energy and which ones drain you. Lastly, if you're interested in hearing more from Josh, consider connecting with him on LinkedIn. If you enjoy this conversation, you'll appreciate his posts full of thoughtful insights he's currently learning. Thank you for being here today. I hope this encourages you to attack the work before you today. All right, Josh, thank you so much for being with us today. Start us off by just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Barb. Happy to be here. And my name is Josh Armstrong, of course. I was raised in a military family. My dad and mom were both in the Army, so I moved all over the place as a kid. And we eventually ended in Florida for my high school and college. So went to a public university there in Florida and joined the military thereafter. Went to kind of assessment and selection during my senior year of college. Joined the Air Force, and while I was in the Air Force, met my now wife. We have 3 children together, and just last year, after 11 years of service, I recently separated, and now I'm a student here at a seminary, kind of discerning my next step to, future service in the church and a couple of other things. That's kind of a once over the world.
Yeah, that's you in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So you mentioned both of your parents being in the Army. What do you feel like, personally, internally led you to serve, and how did you make the choice of, how to do that?
I've been thinking about this ahead of our conversation, and I think that decision to serve is part of a period of my life where the shorthand answer is I was just maturing. I was kind of a boy, and I was introspective, and I realized that in high school. And so going into college, I realized I didn't really know kind of what I believed, why I believed it, what I wanted to do, or what was the appropriate way to see the world, I guess, and operate in it. And college was extremely formative to me, but really senior year of high school is when I think I really started thinking about this stuff. And, high school's a tough time for everybody. So I will speed past, just the embarrassing details of trying to figure out who you are. But I did have a sense I need to grow up.
Yeah.
And, and maybe I wasn't a church growing up too with my mom and dad. And probably, I no doubt the preaching at that church nourished some of that introspection and like an awareness of, hey, that I was not right. And probably some of the ways I related to things and people in the world. And so that drew me into trying to figure that out. And that started in high school, went to college. I was kind of also, there's a lot of platitudes in my church growing up. So I wasn't satisfied with some of the answers. And during that time, I stumbled upon my grandfather's. He had some Bible commentaries that my dad had kept because my dad's dad was a Methodist pastor. And after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and actually went to Iwo Jima, fought there, was a cartographer and mapping out the tunnels. And
oh, wow.
And so I'd never been exposed to like a Bible commentary, which was, I just remember reading this in high school, and there's kind of depth and connectedness between the Bible as a library and discussion of like, even like odd stories. I just remember the weirdest things, how like rabbis in the first century would use caffeine to stay up and read scriptures throughout the night. Yeah. So just weird things like that. And I was curious and I was hungry. And so I would dig into that, and I went into college, and college was like a fresh start. So I didn't know what I wanted to do when I entered college, but I landed on political science as a major. I suppose, hey man, I needed to learn some things about the world, was maybe that what fueled that. And then during that time, I was still reading these little Bible commentaries from my grandfather, and a couple of other variables came together where I had a classmate who was using the GI Bill, had served in Iraq, and then a buddy who was doing this thing called Ranger Challenge, building rope bridges, going across a river. And then after visiting all the different kind of Christian groups on campus, I landed at a particular Lutheran church where a pastor was kind of giving me individual books that he thought would be good for me at this time in my life. And all of that came together, and I knew I wanted to serve in the military. I felt that responsibility. I guess at the same time, I was following the war in Afghanistan. So OEF, one of my assignments, I'd follow the New York Times coverage every day. And so that was a project. And at that point, I was like, okay, maybe law school, maybe something with intelligence. I hadn't thought of the idea of the military, but this vet in my class, talking to a friend who's doing Ranger Challenge, and then probably my dad and my grandfather's service too, it just hit me that someone is doing that on my behalf. And I was overwhelmed with gratitude because college was a great time for me. I was able to learn all sorts of stuff, meet new people, and again, figure out what I believed too. And I was in this church with a pastor who took all my questions very seriously, was very approachable. And so I had kind of two simultaneous desires. I felt a conviction to serve in the military. And I thought the theology and what I'd learned in the church almost reinforced that, because, I anticipated some very hard times in the military. And I had a couple heroes that I was reading at that time too. Probably first and foremost was a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who just in a nutshell, he was a German pastor during the Nazis' rise to power, and was one of the few Germans who resisted the Nazi infiltration of the church, had a radio program speaking out against Hitler, and he had the opportunity to go to Britain and then America and to kind of just get away from all of that mess. But he made the responsible decision in his mind to get back to Germany, because if he was going to be part of that reconstruction process, he had to potentially suffer with his peers and countrymen. And so I remember reading this and I was like, man, this is all because of how he views the world and his relationship with God, the creator, and then his peer creatures. And he wasn't interested in his personal piety. He knew that his relationship with God was based totally on grace. And so he could look to his left and right and say, well, what do my neighbors need? And that was getting Jews out of the country. And eventually, why he's controversial is because he takes part in he's called like martyr, spy, and pastor, but he joins the Abwehr, German intelligence branch, and is part of the conspiracy to get Hitler out of power. So I'm reading this guy and I read his works. So I see his life, and then I read his ethics, the cost of discipleship. And I just like set back on my heels and like, wow, this stuff is important. And later in life, I read Ordinary Men. So I set kind of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life in contrast with Ordinary Men, which is the story about the Reservist Battalion 101, who was part of the final solution in Poland. And this was truck drivers, teachers. It wasn't like the Gestapo going through killing these Jewish men, women, children. It was ordinary people. And it gives firsthand accounts of why they did what they did. And I love Browning. He has this note. He says, the sleepers in Germany weren't like those people who are temperamentally wired to follow an authoritarian, strong man. The true sleepers were those few people who had the moral courage to not partake. And because these stories have examples of the officers saying, hey, no one has to do this. They don't want to, but out of shame and kind of honor amongst their peers or whatever the motivation was, very few actually turn away. And so Bonhoeffer he stands out all the more strongly for me. And so I'm reading him. I'm reading some Martin Luther, who again, he kind of was a turning point in history of Western civilization, the church, and also just all of Western thought. And I feel that responsibility to serve. But then one day, because these guys were not speaking in platitudes, guys like Bonhoeffer, Luther, and of course I was reading my Bible more closely too. It was an account of everything, the entire world. Right. And as a young man, I think I was just hungry for that. Yeah. And it helped